We have two writers from the United States, Ron Rash from Appalachia and Bret Anthony Johnston from Corpus Christi area, Texas. Both writers have a strong regional identity, and we'll be talking afterwards about the connection between American regional writing and Irish writing. I first met Bret, who will read first, an amazing 15 years ago in 2005, when he came to Cork, the year that we were capital of culture, if any of you remember back that far, to read from his extraordinary first collection of stories, Corpus Christi, which had been published the year before in the States. He was a young writer, but as soon as you opened the book, you knew that you were in the hands of a master. As the novelist Jane Hamilton wrote at the time, Johnston's stories read as if they were written by someone who's lived various lives and has had time to develop real wisdom, generosity, and the art of making strong, clean sentences. Since then, his novel, Remember Me Like This, has been a New York Times bestseller and I believe will shortly be a film. And in 2017, he won the Sunday Times Short Story Award for a little masterpiece entitled Half of What Atlee Rouse Knows About Horses. You can find it online through the Sunday Times website and through Bret's own website, and it's really worth going there and reading it. After 11 years as director of the creative writing program at Harvard, Bret is now back in Texas as director of the Michener Center for Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. He's going to read a new story that will appear in his next collection. Thank you, Bret.
Thank you, Alannah, and thank you everybody for joining us to celebrate short stories that don't get nearly enough celebration, even in good years when the earth is on its correct axis, let alone something like now. But yeah, I mean, I certainly thank you, Alannah, for your kind words, and really, really double heartfelt thanks to Patrick for inviting me and for all of his support over the years. My time in Cork is really one of the you know, it's really has a special place in my heart, not least because of its connection to Frank O'Connor, of course, but the people that I came to know when I was over there and have stayed in touch with, certainly Patrick among them. And then it's an honor to read with Ron, a writer that I immensely admire, a writer that I recommend to all of my students. And it's been a few years since Ron and I have seen each other, so this is, you know, this is all the more a nice time for me. So I'm going to read a short story. It's quite short, and it'll be in the next collection, which should be coming out from Random House at some point. That collection is as of right now, it's called Encounters with Unexpected Animals, and this is a story called Caiman. Caiman. Your mother wouldn't let me bring the ice chest into the house, so I left it in the garage. Earlier, I had cut 4 holes into the styrofoam lid. One of them looked like half a star, which I remember liking. This was years ago, a windswept Sunday. This was Texas. When I returned to the kitchen, she pointed at the sink. She said, "Wash your hands with soap." He was breading flounder. She had been listening to radio reports about that little girl who had been abducted. So had I. Probably I pulled over and gave that man $80 because I thought it would keep you safe. He was parked under the causeway, a hand-lettered sign propped against the tire of his van, as if he were just selling pecans or fruit. Your mother had flour dust on her neck. She had already fried the okra, boiled the potatoes. Soon we would call you to the table and you, our little man, would bolt in like you had heard a starter pistol. You were 7, a boy who liked bedtime stories with fantastic monsters and twisty, unexpected endings. You liked sneaking up on us. You hid behind closed doors and in the laundry hamper, then jumped out screaming and laughing. You loved the word maybe. Maybe I'm a kid who's 1,000,000 years old. Maybe we should be a family with a pet. Maybe someday my eyes will turn blue. Your mother swiped her forehead with her wrist. The kitchen was gummy with the day's heat. The windows were open. Before leaving that morning, I had mowed the yard. You helped me rake. You wore your cowboy boots. And now, with dusk coming on, the cut grass smell was rising and trying to cool everything off. She's still missing, your mother said. Now they think that uncle did something. I nodded. I had heard that too, and if it was true, I thought he'd get killed in prison. But I didn't want to talk about such things. Instead, I asked, how's our little man? Worn out, your mother said. He's napping in his room. I had been all day at the job site, drawing overtime. On the drive home, I had seen the man under the causeway and pulled over for a look. Our ice chest was still in the bed of the truck from when we had gone floundering. I took that as a sign. And he only had one left, which also seemed lucky to me. I was excited to surprise you. I was excited to hear what you would name it. Now, I said, I wonder what he'll name it. He asked for a dog, your mother said. A pet, I said. He asked for a pet. Right, she said, a dog, a cat, a goldfish. Pets have fur and show affection. Pets aren't deadly. Goldfish don't have fur, I said. I didn't think she was angry, not really. I took 3 glasses from the cabinet. I said, and it's not deadly. She fixed me with her eyes. She said, it's an alligator. It's a caiman, I said. There's a difference. It's the size of a shoe. Not for long, she said. We turned back to the stove. She laid one piece of fish in the skillet, then another. Grease started snapping. They're smart, I said, repeating what the man had told me. They won't mate until the river is high. They make sure there's enough water for their offspring. They build nests. They're cold-blooded, she said. They have scales. Danny can take it for show and tell, I said. They bite, she said. They bite. They escape into sewers, and they terrorize neighborhoods. They eat regular pets. I laughed at that, but your mother just said, they do. He flipped the fish in the skillet. The sound of frying started up again like distant applause. She blew hair from her eyes, stood with her hip cocked, holding the spatula. The applause quieted. She slipped the fish onto a plate she had covered with a paper napkin to soak up grease. She put 2 more pieces in the pan and watched them sizzle. She said, why would that man take that little girl? We don't know that he did, I said. But you think he did, I said. Yes, I said, I do. I do too, your mother said. You know, she's Danny's age. They could still find her, I said. But you don't think they will. I don't know, honey, I said. I don't know. Well, she said, I don't think they will. She lowered the flame on the stove and turned to stare out the window. She was touching her fingertips to her thumb, one after the other, something she did when she was concentrating. The air in the room was shifting. She said, what would we do if something, it won't, I said. Not to him. She nodded, pressed the heel of her palm to her eyes. She said, we're still getting a dog. I know, I said. And you owe me a new ice chest, she said. I poured milk for you, but I returned our glasses to the cabinet and opened up 2 bottles of beer. The meal was starting to feel like a celebration, like one of us had gotten a raise or was having a birthday. I found some cocoa mix and stirred it into your glass. An alligator, your mother said, shaking her head. Caiman, I said. You know some husbands bring home candy, right? She said, or roses, or diamonds. They're poor wives, I said. They probably just, hey, she said, hey, tell Danny you caught it. Tell him you were fishing and you saw it and you caught it just for him. You want me to lie to our son, I said. I want you to make up a story for him, something with a happy outcome, she said, and she turned back to the stove. She went to the refrigerator and took out the tartar sauce and the salad she had been chilling. The wind lifted the curtains over the sink and sent a few paper napkins gliding off the counter. Your mother closed the window and the kitchen went as quiet as a secret. And then, with the wind shut out, we could hear your boots on the floor in the hallway. You were stalking toward us, planning one of your sneak attacks. Your mother sipped her beer. The flower was still on her neck. It looked like snow, like a smeared galaxy, and she was smiling a little. I understood what she didn't. You had been awake the whole time, listening to us. You already knew about the Caiman, about the flimsy, hopeful story I would tell, about everything else. The only surprise left was that I did believe they could still find that little girl. I thought her uncle might prove everyone wrong. Maybe he cooked her favorite meals, played her favorite movies. Maybe he never touched her. Maybe such extravagant, misguided love was still possible. As a baby, you liked putting your feet in my mouth. You'd laugh until you got the hiccups and your toes would move behind my teeth as slow as growing coral, and I ached to spare you all of what was to come. I wanted to bite down, to crush your perfect bones, to swallow your body whole. Your mother knelt to pick up the strewn napkins. You were just on the other side of the door now, trying not to giggle and preparing your ambush. Maybe you knew we were on to you, maybe not. I joined your mother on the floor. I felt like we were praying or giving thanks or mourning. The kitchen tile was cool, hard. We were listening to you breathe, waiting for you to strike. We were on our hands and knees, our bodies low to the ground, like strange, ancient creatures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bret. Thank you. Oh. So, having recovered slightly, Ron will read for us. Ron Rash is a poet and fiction writer, probably known to many of you who are here. He was born in Chester, South Carolina, where both his parents worked in a textile mill. And when he was 8 years old, his family moved back to North Carolina, a region where his ancestors had lived since the mid-1700s, which is something we might talk about afterwards. Rash's father completed a college degree and later became a college professor. Ron Rash earned his MA from Clemson University in South Carolina, and his writing focuses on the lives of people in rural Southern settings. His best-selling novel, Serena, was a New York Times bestseller and a very successful film. He has published 6 collections of stories, including Burning Bright, which won the 2010 Frank O'Connor Short Story Award here in Cork. And his selected stories, Something Rich and Strange, this wonderful book, is published by HarperCollins and is essential reading. It's just a book that will keep you going for weeks. His stories are remarkable by any standard for their detail, their emotional strength, and their deep knowledge of a very particular rural life. As Kirkus Reviews put it, what makes them so deeply satisfying is that they enlarge our capacity for empathy. Ron is currently professor in Appalachian Cultural Studies at Western Carolina University, and he is going to read now. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to, I wish I were there in person. I'm sure Bret feels the same way, but that cork I have great memories of, and hope that we can do this again. And I appreciate all of your support. And so I'm going to read a story set in this area where I am right now. One thing that might not be as well known in Ireland is that some of the whitewater rivers, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains, are very dangerous. The waters are very swift, and sometimes people will go over a waterfall, not even a large one, and get caught in what's called a hydraulic. And if you get caught in that, unfortunately, you can't get to the surface and you can drown. But this is the title story. It's about 6 pages long, called Something Rich and Strange. She follows the river's edge downstream, leaving behind her parents and younger brother who still eat their picnic lunch. It is Easter break, and her father has taken time off from his job. They have followed the Appalachian Mountains south, stopping first in Gatlinburg, then the Smokies, finally this river. She finds a place above a falls where the water looks shallow and slow. The river is a boundary between Georgia and South Carolina, and she wants to wade into the middle and place 1 foot in Georgia and 1 in South Carolina so she can tell her friends back in Nebraska she has been in 2 states at the same time. She kicks off her sandals and enters. The water so much colder than she imagined, quickly deeper, up to her kneecaps, the current surging under the smooth surface. She shivers. On the far shore, a granite cliff casts this section of river into shadow. She glances back to where her parents and brother sit on the blanket. It is warmer there, the sun full upon them. She thinks about going back, but is almost halfway now. She takes a step, and the water rises higher on her knees. 4 more steps, she tells herself. Just 4 more and I'll turn back. She takes another step and the bottom is no longer there, and she is being shoved downstream, and she does not panic because she has passed all her Red Cross courses. Water shallows and her face breaks the surface and she breathes deep. She tries to turn her body so she won't hit her head on a rock, and for the first time she's afraid, and she's suddenly back underwater and hears the rush of water against her ears. She tries to hold her breath, but her knee smashes against a boulder and she gasps in pain and water pours into her mouth. Then for a few moments, the water pools and slows. She rises, coughing up water, gasping air, her feet dragging the bottom like an anchor, trying to snag waterlogged wood or rock jut. And as the current quickens again, she sees her family running along the shore, and she knows they are shouting her name, though she cannot hear them. And as the current turns her, she hears the falls and knows there's nothing that will keep her from it as the current quickens and quickens, and another rock smashes against her knee, but she hardly feels it as she snatches another breath, and she feels the river fall, and she falls with it as water whitens around her, and she falls deep into the whiteness, and as her head rises, scrapes against a rock ceiling, and the water holds her there, and she tells herself, don't breathe, but the need rises inside her, beginning in the upper stomach, then up through her chest and throat, and as that need reaches her mouth and nose open, and the lungs explode in pain. And then the pain is gone as bright colors shatter around her like glass shards. And she remembers her 6th grade science class, the gurgle of the aquarium at the back of the room, the smell of chalk dust that morning. The teacher held a prism out the window so it might fill with color. And she has a final, beautiful thought. that she is now inside that prison and knows something even the teacher does not know, that the prison's colors are voices, voices that swirl around her head like a crown. And at that moment, her arms and legs, she did not even know were flailing, cease, and she becomes part of the river. The search and rescue squad and the sheriff arrived at the falls later that afternoon. Two of the squad members were brothers, one in his early 20s, the other 30. They had a carpentry business, building patios and decks for lawyers and doctors from Greenville and Columbia who owned second homes in these mountains. The third man, the diver, was in his early 40s and taught biology at the county high school. The sheriff looked at his watch and figured they had 2 hours at most before the gorge darkened. Even so, the diver did not hurry to put on his wetsuit and air tanks. He smoked a cigarette and between puffs talked to the sheriff about the high school's baseball team. They had worked together before and knew death punched no time clock. When the diver was ready, a length of nylon rope was clasped tight under his arms. The older, stronger brother held the other end. The diver waded into the river, the rope trailing behind him like a leash. He dipped his mask in the water, put it on, and leaned forward. The three men on shore watched as the black fins propelled the diver into the hydraulic, ceaseless blizzard of whitewater. The men on the bank sat on rocks and waited. With his free hand, the older brother pointed upstream to a bend where he caught a 5-pound trout last fall. The sheriff asked what he used for bait, but didn't hear the answer because the mask bobbed up and the headwaters foamed. The brother tightened the slack and pulled, but nothing gave until the others grabbed hold as well. They pulled the diver into the shallows and helped him on the shore. Between watery coughs, he told them he'd found her in the undercut behind the hydraulic. She had been upright, her head and back and legs pressed against a rock slab. Only her hair moved, its long strands streaming upward. As the diver had drifted closer, he saw that her eyes were open. Their faces were inches apart when he slipped an arm around her waist. Then the hydraulic ripped free the mask and mouthpiece, grabbed the dive light, spiraling it toward the darkness. The diver told the men kneeling beside him that the girl's blue eyes had life in them. He could feel her heart beating against his chest and hear her whispering. Before or after your mask was torn off, the sheriff asked. The diver did not know, but swore he'd never entered the river again. The younger brother scoffed, while the older spoke of narcosis, though the pool was no more than 25 feet deep. But the sheriff did not dismiss what the diver said. He too had seen strange and inexplicable things involving the dead, but had never mentioned them to others and did not choose to now. We'll find another way, he said. But that river has to lower some before I allow anyone else in there. The diver had trouble sleeping afterward. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's wide blue eyes, the flowing golden hair. His wife slept beside him, her body curled into his chest. They had no children, and now he was glad for that. He'd seen a picture of the parents in the local paper. They'd been on the shore within 30 feet of the undercut that held their daughter, the expressions on their faces beyond grief. On the third night, the diver fell into a deeper sleep and the girl came with him. They were in the undercut now, but now the river was tepid and he could breathe. As he embraced her, she whispered that this world was better than the one above, and she would never and should never have been afraid. He emerged from his wife's embrace. It's just a bad dream, she kept saying until he quit gasping. His wife closed her eyes and was quickly asleep, but he could not so went to the kitchen and graded lab tests until dawn. The girl remained in the river. Volunteers cast grappling hooks from the banks and worked them like lures through the pool, or stood in shallows or on rocks and jabbed with long metal poles. Some of the old timers suggested dynamite, but the girls' parents would not hear of it. The sheriff said what they needed was a week without rain. The diver slept little the next few nights. In class, he placed the students in small groups and had them discuss assigned chapters among themselves. He knew they talked about the prom instead of science, but he didn't care. On the third afternoon, he skipped the teacher's meeting and sat alone in his classroom. The school, emptied of students, was quiet. The only sound, the gurgle of the aquarium. He would never speak to anyone, not even his wife, about what happened in the classroom stillness. But that evening, he told the sheriff he'd dive for the girl again. Days passed. Rain came often, long rains that made every fold of ridge land a tributary and merged earth and water into a deep orange-yellow rush. Banks disappeared as the river reached out and dragged them under. But that was only surface. In the undercut, all remained quiet and still, the girl's transformation unrushed, gentle. Crayfish and minnows unknitted flesh from bone, attentive to loose threads. Then the rain stopped and the river ran clear again. Boulders vanished for weeks, reappeared. Sandbars and stick jams regathered in new configurations. The water warmed and caddisflies broke through the river's skin to make their brief flights before falling back into their element. The sheriff called the diver and told him the river was low enough to try again. The next day, they walked the half mile down the path to the falls. There were 5 of them this time: the sheriff, his deputy, the 2 brothers, and the diver. The sheriff insisted on 2 ropes, making sure they stayed taut. The water was clearer than last time and offered less resistance. The diver entered the abeyance as though parting a curtain. The river suddenly muted. She was less of what she had been. The blue rubbed from her eyes, flesh freed from the chandelier of bone. He touched what once had been a hand. The river whispered to him that it would not be long now. When he returned to shore, he told them her body was gone, not even a scrap of clothing or bone. He told them the last hard rain must have swept her downstream. The younger brother said the diver should go back and search the left and right sides of the falls. He argued the body could still be there. The deputy suggested they lower an underwater camera into the pool. Sheriff shook his head and said to let her be. The men walked up the trail, back toward their vehicles, their lives. The midday sun leaned close and dazzling. Dogwoods bloomed small white stars. The diver knew in the coming days the petals would find their way into the river, drifting onto sandbars and gilding the backs of pools. And the diver knew some would drift through the rapids and over the falls into the hydraulic. They would furl amid the last bones, and like the last bones, they would finally slip free.
Thank you very much, Ron. So, 2 very different writers, 2 very different stories, and two very different voices. Would you perhaps, Ron, like to say something about belonging to a place in somewhere as big as the United States?
Yeah, well, I provide a place, and I think the fact that my family's lived in this region for such a long time certainly has made me feel a connection to it that I might not if I were more transient. But I think that ultimately what we're, when we write about a particular place, is that we're like farmers drilling for water. If we go deep enough into that place, we're going to hit the universal. Now that's a mixed metaphor, but I think I think you know that if you can get that one place right, Eudora Welty, one of my favorite American writers, said one time that one place comprehended makes all other places more understood. And
that's
I think
great. Yes, that's so true. And
how
how come you know so much about your past? Because that's quite unusual, isn't it?
Well, no, maybe not as much. I'll be interested to hear Bret on this too, but my family has been, we've been very good at keeping records. And I think there's been a kind of pride, that our family kind of kept up with where we've been and how long we've been in these areas. So, and we've had some really good researchers, people, genealogists who've gone back and kind of kept this. Particularly, I have a cousin who did magnificent work. I mean, he spent years, and that's just a trove because you get so many stories. But I think I find that landscape, and once again, it'd be interesting to hear Bret on this. Part of what I try to do in my work is I want landscape to be a character, but also I believe that landscape actually affects us enough psychologically that it becomes sometimes almost a dominant force. And I think sometimes for me, landscape is destiny.
Right. And Bret, are you that closely connected to your Texan roots?
I mean, I love hearing Ron talk about this, especially in light of his work. I don't have the family record that Ron describes, and yet I feel as though we arrive at the same place by different paths. I agree vehemently with the idea that place is destiny, and the way that I think about it is that a place, whether it's Appalachia, whether it's Texas, whether it's County Cork, it forms and informs character. It forms and informs action, it's a fractal relationship with itself in a certain way, in that we're having this conversation on Zoom right now. And I would go so far as to say that this conversation would be vastly different if we were all in the same room together. If there were the same participants were here, but if we were in a room in County Cork, if we were in a room in North Carolina, if we were in a room in Texas, the conversation would be shaped by that room. If we were beside the creek that's running outside my house, our conversation with the same people in it would be shaped differently because we're outside beside that creek. If we're in the mountains of North Carolina, it's going to be a different conversation, even though it's the same people. And when you think about that in a story, it suddenly opens the story up in a way that I believe Miss Welty was speaking to in that amazing quote.
Yes, and yet you're from two very different areas, but they have each somehow, in spite of the homogeneity of modern life, they've retained very distinctive, different speech patterns. If this were, let's say, Europe, you'd probably be speaking a different language altogether. You're both speaking English, but you're both speaking a very different kind of English and writing a very different kind of English. Would you agree with that, Bret? Because in your case, it's perhaps less evident on the page. Or is it not?
Yeah, I think I would mostly agree with it. It feels to me less like and again, I would love to hear Ron's take on this, and basically I would defer to Ron. Whatever Ron says, that's what rules the day. But my sense is it's not so much that we're speaking a different language, it's that we're probably speaking in a different syntax. And so it's the same tools, it's the same material, but we're syntactically building different structures. That's how it feels to me.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be. Yeah, that's actually interesting because sometimes what happens is that a verb can be used as a noun, and those kinds of things can be interesting. And I think one area is similes. I think that's where you really do get a difference because the good similes always reflect or can reflect the region, and I think that's also something, just being attuned to the place and to the language. And one thing I love about folk languages is that their similes are always amazing because they reflect the place that they're in. And one of my uncles once said that a young woman didn't have enough clothes on to wad a shotgun, to stuff a shotgun. And that's a beautiful simile. I actually have novels to get into a novel, but those kinds of what people are doing with the language is always fascinating to me, and I think that's something I think Bret would agree. I mean, one aspect that I love about the Irish writers, and always have, is their use of the colloquial. I just read Kevin Barry's not so new book, but new book to me, and I just love what he did with those two voices.
Yeah, he's amazing with the West of Ireland idioms. Mm-hmm. And I guess, that goes way, way back, even to when the Brits were still here. Mm-hmm. The language used in Irish stories is just so different.
And that is one thing that I would say for me personally, and it's because of my deep root in this region, that a part of what I'm trying to do is preserve that language. And I think that through the writing, because it does change. The younger generation does not speak as much this older language dialect, but it still retains. It's still there.
I think you might have an advantage being in a mountainous region. They're always able to retain their language longer than the plains, where you can get overrun by incomers. Is it time to ask whether there are any questions from the audience? I know you both have great admirers among those in our virtual room. Would someone like to ask something of Ron or Bret?
I want to say one thing about Bret's story, which I thought was really effective. But Chekhov is I've been reading a lot of Chekhov lately, and what he does that's really amazing is he'll have one detail that makes you believe the whole story. And when that woman had the flower on her neck, that is the kind of precise detail that makes the reader just believe in the story, that just puts the reader deeper and deeper in the story. That struck me immediately when Bret was reading.
Great.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you.
So did I see a question? Yes.
See a hand up.
Yeah. Hey, y'all. Hey, Ron. I'm Claire Fullerton. The Irish, and I once lived in Ireland. I lived in Connemara years ago. The Irish are known as the greatest storytellers of all times. The Irish claim, and I'm loosely one of lineage, and it's the gift of gab. We've heard it. And yet, so are Southerners. Southerners are known as the greatest storytellers. We sit on the porch. We tell the tales of the family. We sip the sweet tea, and that's what we do. And I can't really think of another culture that are known as the great storytellers. So my question would be along the lines of the similarities that you see when you read the Irish writers and the Southern writers. What do you see, if any, as a common thread?
Oh, so much. I would say, one, the South has always been separate from the rest of the United States. So, I mean, and not usually, but the poorest region, the region that has been neglected, still is in many ways. So you've got that sense, I think, of being, it's almost like the connection to Great Britain, to England, I think, in some ways. But also the idea of religion, the importance of religion, pro and con in that, but the sense of that has been important. I think just the sense of being a rural, I know that, obviously not all the writers are rural, but when I read Seamus Heaney, I certainly see that, feel that world is very much my own. So I think all of those things, but I also really do believe there's a delight in the language. I think part of it may be actually tied into religion because of that love of oratory, of that. And also one final thing, almost all the great music America's produced come out of the South. And I think that the musicality, all that's intertwined. Bret, what do you think?
I of course agree with all of that. The only two things that I can immediately think to add, one is I would just underscore the attention to language, the joy, the pleasure, the reward of a well-made sentence, let alone a well-made story. I remember I was years and years and years ago, I was at a department meeting, and it was a few months after Seamus Heaney had suffered a stroke, and he sent a letter to the department, and the chair of the department read it aloud, and I will always remember that the first four words of the letter, the first complete sentence of the letter was, "So then the ambulance." And he went from the ambulance, and he traced everything down. As only he could. He traced everything down through his fear, through his despair. And it landed on, he was in the hospital bed, and he was staring at his feet. He was staring at his toes, and he saw that with great effort, and after a significant amount of time, as I understood it, he was able to move his toes. And that's when he knew that he was going to survive this. And so it started with verbatim, "So then the ambulance." And it wove down through prose, but it was basically poetry, all the way down to him looking at his feet and wiggling his toes and knowing that he's going to be okay. And if you start with "So then the ambulance" and you wind up with wiggling your toes, it brings me to the next thing that I feel like is one of the strongest conduits between Ireland and great Southern writing, and that would be humor. I think there's a reverence for humor, whether it be gallows humor, whether it be slapstick humor, anything, and I think you see that in both spheres.
That's a great thing to put your finger on. Certainly.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So what other writers are we talking about when we think Irish writers? We've got Kevin Barry, Seamus Heaney, Frank O'Connor got a little mention. Guest of the Nation is very much Richard Ford's favorite story. Would either of you have time for it?
Well, I can name some of my favorite writers quickly. Patrick Kavanagh is a writer that I love. Joyce, obviously. Edna O'Brien is one of my favorites. She's written, The Connor Girls has the best last line of a short story I know of. Kevin Barry, Colin McCann, obviously. He and I did an event 2 weeks ago. I mean, it just rolled, they just kind of,
yeah.
And Costello, a younger writer, is really good. Yeah.
And Bret, do you read Irish writers a lot?
I do, and I think of some somewhat. I mean, of course, and I don't know if it came through, but of course William Trevor, and then I think of a couple of folks like Sally Rooney, Paul Murray, and the way that I was thinking about them when Ron was talking about preserving the language and the cadence of language and how young people do use language differently than the previous generations. And so when you read some of those younger Irish writers, they're, I think, preserving their language in a way that certainly Frank O'Connor, Ed O'Brien, Joyce, of course, and for me that, in terms of contemporary writers, if we're leaving out Frank O'Connor, it would be William Trevor.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Sally Rooney has a whole new style of narration that she seems to have evolved in the course of 2 books, which is very strong and very new. And I think not at all gimmicky. It's something.
And it's spawning, as someone who teaches in a very high level graduate writing program, it is spawning many very bad imitations.
Oh dear. I was hoping you were going to say good. But, I think it's always the case, isn't it? When there's someone new and very strong, everyone else will start to try and write.
And it's not so much the students who arrive at the Michener Center, but we see. I mean, we get hundreds of applications, and you read these writers, and you think, oh, they're just aping Sally Rooney right now, and we hope they'll apply again once they've found their own voice in the way that Sally did.
Very good. And you also teach, Ron?
I do. I do. I teach a fiction writing class. We don't have an MFA program. We just have a straight MA. But
right.
we have some good students. Actually, I just read a story by a 19-year-old that I'll send to you, Bret, in a couple of years. I think she's going to be something else. And I was just stunned by her. Actually, I've been here 17 years. She's the best the best writing student I've had. And she's, I teach some grad students. So, yeah, and I teach, I teach some of the writers I love. Chekhov is actually the writer. I've really been immersed in his work for the last month. Really, I guess I've read about 50 stories. And when I was younger, I just did not connect with him the way I do now. I think part of it's just you have to have lived longer.
You too, Bret? Did you come to Chekhov late-ish?
I did, and it's funny when Ron paid me that incredibly high and misguided compliment where he spoke my name and Chekhov's in the same sentence. I was thinking that when I was in school and all of my teachers and some of my peers were kind of singing about Chekhov from the rooftops, I read Chekhov and I just didn't get it. And so all I did was lie. I just would say like, oh yeah, Chekhov, he's great. Like, yeah, that's that dog and that lady is amazing. But then as Ron says, you return to those stories after you've got, after you've been around the block a few times and it just makes you want to throw up your hands and surrender. I mean, it's just like, why are we trying?
Exactly what I've been doing in the last 2-3 years. I had a complete Chekhov blind spot. I just couldn't see it. And then Joyce Carol Oates rewrote The Lady with the Dog. I don't know if you've read that. It's worth seeking out. It's very funny. but it's probably not much to do with Chekhov.
Right.
But I think it's like, there's such an accepted opinion that, oh, he's the greatest. And in fact, since Richard Ford wrote the introduction to his collection of Chekhov, I think about 12 years ago, we've all been able to say, okay, some of his stories are terrible.
Yeah.
Some of them are extraordinary, but he wrote for money when he was younger.
Oh, yeah.
And not all.
Well, he wrote, what, 800 stories?
200, I think, 220.
Okay.
About that. Maybe more. Who knows?
I would encourage anybody, and certainly Ron and Alannah, if y'all are in this renaissance, as we should all be lucky enough to be, if you haven't read his letters are amazing. His letters are just works of art unto themselves, in the way that they talk about writing, the way they talk about character, the way they talk about the ways in which the various orbits of his life would intersect on the page and off the page. His letters, I'm as much of a fan of his letters as I am his fiction. Okay,
they're definitely going on the must-read list then. I think some of the comments I've picked up over this period of relooking at his work come from the letters. So that is to be looked forward to.
I would say I actually taught The Dead last week, and that was fun. Going back to that story, I hadn't read it in a couple of years, and it just struck me that whole story hinges on one word. And I don't know if I'm wrong about this. I may well be, but at the end of the story, when Gabriel talks about the generous tears, I mean, the perspective on that, is that inside his head or is that omniscient? It's all the difference. And
it's a new story every time you read it.
Yeah, and that's another story where, once again, you hear about how great it is. Hey, it really is.
Turns out,
yeah. Are there any other Irish short story writers that the audience would like to recommend to these two experts? I'm thinking.
Well, I'll tell you a short novel.
Who?
Billy O'Callaghan.
Billy O'Callaghan, there you are.
Billy O'Callaghan, I love him.
Okay.
It reminds me of the Irish Ron. And every time I read Billy O'Callaghan, I think he's doing what Ron Rash is doing, but with an Irish accent. And he has a great understanding of landscape. But Billy O'Callaghan, I've been watching this guy for 2 years and just waiting for him to sweep across America, and he's coming. Yep. He's coming.
Claire Keegan is a writer. I think very good. I would put her in there, and there's a short novel that I don't know if it got much attention in Ireland or not, but it's by Bernard McLeod. It's called Cal, C-A-L. And that's one of the most stunning short novels I've ever read.
Yeah, it is indeed.
And he writes stories too. Yeah, he writes short stories.
I'm thinking, I'm glad that Ron mentioned Claire Keegan. I'm also thinking, and I don't know if he's written stories, and that's my failing, but the Irish writer Joseph O'Connor, who just did that book Shadow Play, is that what it's called? I believe. Yeah. I think he does some very, very interesting things in the way that storytelling and story making and where they overlap. I think he does a wonderful job of layering that in his work. Shadow Play is about how Bram Stoker came to write Dracula.
Yes.
And I was enchanted by the book. And going back to the comment that we made earlier, I did not expect that book to be as funny as it is. But it's and I've read a few books of his since then. But yeah, he's a writer that probably doesn't need any help from me, but I would certainly recommend him. And
another who I rediscovered through Colin McCann, who wrote a brilliant essay for the 100th birthday of Benedict Kiley, who's a Northern Irish writer. And his stories are just totally amazing. I think they're due for a major renaissance.
Yeah, I've read him, and really like him. I'm looking on my bookshelf because I've got his book right up here.
That's right. Yeah, he's so full of energy. The words pour out of him. And he's very funny and he's very sharp.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate humor more and more because sometimes I'm weary of certain writers who, sometimes, a writer will be viewed as
22 hours.
Yeah.
so feeling so what were the words? Whatever. But I'm not buying it. But what I love about humor is it's either funny or it isn't.
Yeah. That's what Kevin Barry has on his side. He can be very funny.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid it is now 9:00. So we must say goodbye and thank you very, very much to Bret and to Ron. And I hope we're all in the same real room in the not too distant future.